And we all have a ticket for the drawing afterwards. David was very kind. I guess he was at Twin Bridges, and the folks at Winston, when they knew he was coming here to speak, recognized the shared history we have with the R.L. Winston Rod Company, and they said, "Hey, you got to take one to give to a lucky member of our club." I think that's how it worked out.
Yes, we have a project manager down in that area out of Dillon, working the whole Southwest Montana, and Winston's been good to us, supporting our work, and exactly as you said, they recognize the history of this club and the ties to Winston, and so wanted us to bring a Montana-made Winston here and put it in somebody's hands.
Perfect.
And then they threw in a Bauer reel to go with it.
Yeah, and by the way, I have that set up, and it's killer. You're going to be glad whoever wins it. With no further ado, let me hand the time over to David Brooks.
Thanks, Jim. Really appreciate you all having me. Just a few hours we got to spend out here. It's a really marvelous, unique place. Kelly and I had the good fortune a few years ago of being in the other angling club on the other coast in New York, and this is our scene here. We really have enjoyed what we've seen. You all are lucky, and the place is fortunate that you keep it up and keep the tradition on. I was glad to see so many hands about people going to Montana. Even if you're not going to Montana this year, how about hands for people who have been? So how about some rivers you fished there?
Madison. Slough Creek.
Slough Creek, back here. Other hands? Missouri. Big Hole. Bitterroot. Yeah, so I mean, this was the challenge. Jim invited me to talk, and he said, "Yeah, talk about Montana rivers. Stay in the rivers." I thought, I don't know, Jefferson, Gallatin, Madison, Yellowstone, Bighorn, Missouri, Kootenai, Forks of the Flathead. Like, what am I going to talk about? I'm fortunate enough to live and work in a place where we're pretty rich in trout waters, and many of which and how to narrow it down to a few, because he also said I couldn't keep you here all night, especially if we started late. So what I've tried to do is narrow it down to 3 rivers that are super important to me personally, play a big part in my life. They are, I think, treasured, iconic Montana rivers, but they also really exemplify, I think, the challenges that trout water faces in Montana and probably in a lot of the West, as well as the work that Montana Trout Unlimited and Trout Unlimited nationally does across the West to protect these places and make them what they are. Plus, they're just fun rivers to talk about. And the first one probably needs no introduction. I mean, if you're going to talk about fly fishing in Montana, it's pretty hard to get away from talking about the river that runs through it, the Big Blackfoot, at some point. And this is not the most fished river by angler days, not the most popular. If you've been on it, the Blackfoot is in western Montana. It starts right on the Continental Divide, one of the places that has recorded the coldest temperature in the lower 48 states at 60-something below, which we almost broke that record this year. Flows west about 130 miles. In its upper stretches, it's pretty slow, fast-running tributaries that are spawning tributaries for trout, and then it gets kind of slow and meandering through moose and thick grizzly bear country, and then there's a middle canyon stretch, the Box Canyon, where the fishery transfers somewhat from native West Slope cutthroat and bull trout into a mix of rainbow and brown trout fishery, and then on down to its confluence with the Clark Fork. It's the whole way there are just beautiful trout water every minute that you're on that river. It's the kind of place where there's no frog water that you're rowing through or wading past. And so it's a very active river. If you remember, in A River Runs Through It, Norman McLean wrote about, the movie talks about these high jumping, hard fighting fish. Part of that's because in the Blackfoot they reflect the character of the river. It's a pretty fast-moving, active river characterized by lots of in-stream habitat like big boulders and rock gardens and a few named rapids, long, bedrock ledges on the bottom of the river. Every minute of it feels very fishy and isn't quite fishy. The other thing the Blackfoot has going for it is that with the exception of a few places at its lower end and upper end where there's a road that you can see the river occasionally, it's pretty unroaded in terms of when you're down on the water, you feel like you're in a wild place. There are big ponderosa stands and cottonwood stands with bald eagles that swoop down and try to grab fish in front of you. And yet it has great access. All the little fish on this map are access sites. If you fished in Montana, you know we have a stream access law that allows the public to be on any water like the Blackfoot, that you can float down, drop anchor, get out, wade fish, even camp as long as you're below the high water mark. And the Blackfoot is rich in access, and so you can get on any place, upper river, middle river, lower river. Again, it's this mix of native and wild fish that offer all kinds of opportunity. A couple of classic photos of it. Certainly recreation happens on the river beyond fishing. A lot of it, you know, just people rowing and paddling. Most of it, you know, floating the Blackfoot, if you haven't done it, it's a raft game because it's such an active river and so much, you know, either heavy riffles to whitewater. About 3 years ago, right after runoff, I was floating and entering the one named rapid on the river, the Thibodaux Falls, and there was a drift boat on its side, half submerged up against the big entry boulder with a bunch of gear in it. And I'd not read about any deaths or disaster on the Blackfoot, so I think a few people walked away with just a scary story and about a $15,000 mistake they made that day. And so, you know, if you're doing it yourself on the Blackfoot, bring the rubber, not the drift boat. As far as fishing goes, like I said, it's in its upper stretches, known for its West Slope cutthroat trout and bull trout, which are not legal to angle for there. People do catch them occasionally, but because they're an endangered species on the ESA list, you can't intentionally angle for them. But they are in good numbers in that upper river. And, you know, fishing the Blackfoot, in terms of how we fish it, it is really... So aficionados of Norman Maclean's story, the book or the movie, will probably remember when the two brothers, Norman and Paul, are reflecting on their father, the Reverend Maclean, teaching them to fish, instilling fish in them. And they say that, you know, they took away from their father that the disciples were all fishermen, and in particular fly fishermen. And the favorite among those disciples, John, must have been a dry fly fisherman only. And you can see why, when you spend time on the Blackfoot, that would be the perception, because it really does beg for dry flies. There's just so much pocket water, so many seams, and it's so changeable. And it's so clear that you see strikes happen that it's just a really fun dry fly. It has some of the classic hatches that we have in Montana. One unique thing about the Blackfoot is the salmon fly and then golden stone hatches that happen later than most of the other rivers, particularly in western Montana. The Blackfoot's really probably the last river to awaken from winter in western Montana. And so when, you know, squallas and salmon flies and golden stones have happened elsewhere, they're still to come on the Blackfoot. Like this week, we've been hearing about people fishing the Bitterroot and starting to see some of those hatches. The Blackfoot still has ice on its shoulders and probably will for a while. So it'll wake up later and be a great option later into the summer. And those same hatches, the salmon flies and golden stones, can last well into June and even into early July. And then you transfer and you get great green drake hatches on the Blackfoot. There's a Hecuba hatch that I really love just because it's such an interesting looking bug. My coworker Kelly is a big fan of what is a really renowned spruce moth hatch that lasts late into summer, early to fall, transfers into sort of hopper season there. It also can be a great streamer fishing river if you're not just a dry fly purist like the disciple John, because again, a lot of the pocket water is deep, and you can run streamers through and angle for particularly the big browns and rainbows. We do, as a conservation organization, you know, sort of press people to not be fishing really big double articulated streamers in the upper river where there are bull trout because you can't legally target them, and that's likely what's to eat a streamer up there. In terms of fish numbers, and I'm not going to overwhelm you with data, but a couple of slides here. The top graphs I have are of the sort of upper to middle river. The bottom graph is middle to lower river. And one thing you'll see on this is all fish of 6 inches or older, so essentially fish that have recruited to the population as year-old fish and older. And the other thing to point out on all these graphs is that the data for the Blackfoot really begins in 1988, and I'll explain why that's important here in a minute. Rainbow trout, you know, as far as fish graphs go, that's super steady rainbow numbers. You know, you could draw a horizontal line through there, and in the upper river you're looking at about 150 to 200 fish per mile. Pretty good numbers for a, you know, freestone river, undammed. At least currently it's undammed, and I'll talk about that as well. Middle lower river, as you get more, like I said, into the rainbow trout, you know, we're looking at 500, 600 fish per mile. So again, very healthy rainbow trout fishery for a freestone, undammed river. Brown trout, same thing. I mean, this is just incredibly level fish counts for most rivers in Montana. And while the numbers are lower for brown trout, about 100 through the historic survey in the upper river, when you get to middle, lower river, you're looking at, you know, certainly 100 or more brown trout. The brown trout are of much bigger size than the rainbow, so it's a size game with the brown trout, and again, that can mean really good streamer fishing for brown trout on the Blackfoot. These graphs here are, especially the upper river, the real anomaly with our native trout in the Blackfoot. And there's a steady gain of West Slope cutthroat trout that's the native for Montana. It's our Montana state fish. And what I want to point out with these graphs is when you start in 1988 with these surveys, in the upper river, we're about at 0. And in the lower river, just a tick above with an error bar such that we're not really much above 0. And that's going to become important, as is the fact that with the native fish, we're seeing an upward trend, which is really startling in this day and age to see increases in native trout in Montana and probably through most of the West. And the reason why is that in, well, I don't want to spoil the punchline there yet quite. When Norman Maclean published his story, A River Runs Through It, in 1976, that was, of course, a few decades after Winnie's writing about, right? He's writing about a fishery in Prohibition era, you know, early 30s, in this really robust trout fishery. By the time that book was published in 1976, the Blackfoot was crap. I mean, it was in the toilet. It was, people weren't fishing it. Our Fish Wildlife Department was not surveying it. They had given up on the river as a trout fishery, and there was just really no reason to go to the Blackfoot anymore by 1976. We met with a gentleman the other day that said he fished the Blackfoot around about this time and was super frustrated because it was beautiful water, and he thinks in 2 days he never even turned to fish. And I was like, well, I mean, I've never seen you fish, so I can't definitively say it wasn't your fishing, but it probably wasn't your fishing. It was the fishery. It was that on its heels by 1976. And the reasons were that the Blackfoot, in many ways, was an industrial river. It had felt the pressures of industrial logging, industrial hard rock mining, and cattle grazing. I mean, this is the Blackfoot in the early 1900s. And this happened year after year as the hillsides in the Blackfoot Valley were logged, clear-cut. Logs were sent down. You know, they logged in the winter then, slid the logs down the hill on the snow and ice. They just piled up on the sides of the frozen river, and when spring runoff came, those logs came down in big rafts, which you can see kind of vaguely here, to Milltown, which is about half a mile above the confluence of the Clark Fork River, to where they'd come in this check dam and they'd be milled at the mill, and a lot of that lumber was being sent up the Clark Fork River to the mines of Butte. And so The Blackfoot was part of the whole major mining complex that is a lot of Montana's history through both world wars. And it took a huge toll on the river. In addition, at the confluence of the Blackfoot and the Clark Fork was Milltown Dam. That was a hydro dam powering all the mills. And so complete fish barrier there. So by mid-century, the Blackfoot was in tough shape already. And then it got worse. The year before Maclean's book was published, so 1975, in the upper river, in its very headwaters, a old mining complex called the Mike Horse Mine Complex had an earth dam holding back hundreds of tons of toxic sediment and toxic tailings from a century of mining. And a big rain on snow event that spring, 1975, blew out the dam. All those toxic sediment moved down the river. Huge fish kills. For years after, whenever there were big rains or during runoff, there would be fish kills in the river too. And of course, the fish kills got smaller because there were just fewer fish, to where again, it was a devastated fishery. This photo was taken in 2016. I took this going up to tour the Mike Horse Mine site after it had been designated as a Superfund site and cleanup was beginning there. But this is Mike Horse Creek. This is the absolute headwater trout stream of the Blackfoot River. It was running orange with sulfuric acid and a whole cocktail of contaminants. 3 years later, 2019, Kelly and I went up there to tour the restoration, same stretch of creek. It's now been rebuilt, new willows planted, woody debris in the banks, some pool drop structures put in, and clean water. And this is one of my favorite photos. Kelly standing at Mike Horse Creek and Bear Trap Creek that come together, and this is the absolute headwater of the Blackfoot, and we saw a little fry swimming around this, and it was just a great day to see what restoration could do to one of the major problems of the Blackfoot. While this was a huge $40 million federal Superfund site, the other thing that has happened in the Blackfoot since the 80s is that 1988 Montana Trout Unlimited, long before I was there, put up seed money to the state of Montana to restart fish surveys. In particular, to go looking for, okay, what are the problems? Where can we fix them? And they sent out a fisheries biologist by the name of Ron Pierce, who wound up tromping up every tributary in the Blackfoot and writing up essentially a list of, here's all these tributaries, here's the problem with grazing, with old logging, with streams that have been straightened, with diversion ditches that are capturing fish and they're dying in the ditch. All the problems with the fishery, and here's how to fix them. And since then, 1988, which you'll remember is when those surveys began, the Blackfoot chapter of Trout Unlimited, Montana Trout Unlimited, landowners up there, state agency, federal agencies have been just going through Ron Pierce's list of problems and fixes and doing the work. And that has amounted to almost 800 restoration projects, everything from screening ditches, rebuilding tributaries, keeping cows out of riparian habitat, about $20+ million worth of work, and it's ongoing, and it's really the story of the Blackfoot. And the big takeaway here for me is that in 1992, when Robert Redford made Norman Maclean's A River Run Through It into a movie, he opted to film that movie not on the Blackfoot, but on the Gallatin River, across the Continental Divide, not even a western flowing river. In part, it's because it had better road access and he could get his camera crews to the river, but in part because, there's no way a beginning angler like, what's his name, Brad Pitt, could have caught a fish in the Blackfoot even in 1992. It just it was not healthy enough to play itself in the movie. And I think today, if that movie were remade, it could be filmed on the Blackfoot with great success. And that's just a tremendous story in the world of trout and trout fishing and rivers in Montana and beyond. So we take a lot of pride in what the Blackfoot is, and it can be done in our days of sort of doom and gloom and the way the world and the environment are going. This is an example where people did it right. And a lot of that's because they simply cared about trout. The next river I want to talk about, I actually think of as kind of the sister river to the Blackfoot in some ways, but on the opposite side of the Continental Divide. I think somebody in here said they'd fished the Big Hole. I heard Big Hole, yeah. So Big Hole, classic Montana river, similar to the Blackfoot in some ways in that it's also a freestone river, no dams on it, flows about 130-ish miles, about the same length as the Blackfoot. It's a mix of native trout and wild trout in the river. Again, Freestone River starts in the Beaver Head Mountains and kind of goes north, south, and eventually into the Jefferson and the Missouri on into the Mississippi. And so like the Blackfoot, you know, it's a main stem headwater river to one of our nation's great waterways, the Mississippi in this case, the Blackfoot ultimately going out into the Columbia. It too has great access. I mean, every point on here is a place that, you know, the public or anybody can get onto the river and wade fish or float fish throughout the entire thing. It starts, I mean, the unique things about the Big Hole are that it's much more of a wide spread out ag valley, especially in the upper reaches. A lot flatter, totally safe to take a drift boat on, a lot less. That picture's kind of blurry. That's not my eyes, is it? It's a lot less rocky and a lot less obvious trout structure, but a lot more riparian habitat, undercut grassy banks, and hence it's the great and really well-known brown trout fishery. Big browns in the Big Hole are a common angler's target. It does have a section in the middle that is a bit more Blackfoot-like in that there's a canyon stretch for a few miles in the middle, but it's not as much in the way of rapids and rocks as the Blackfoot. And so as you see here, people are commonly fishing it in a drift boat without turning the thing upside down. The really unique thing about the Big Hole is what we call the Big Hole Grand Slam. Has anybody heard of the Big Hole Grand Slam? Do you know what that is? So the Big Hole, to my knowledge, is the only river in the lower 48 states in which in one day, on one stretch, you can catch 5 different fish, all in the trout family. I mean, it's most famous for its big brown trout. It's probably, for many of us, equally famous for being one of the only 2 places in the lower 48 states that still has a completely fluvial population, meaning they only dwell in rivers and streams. There's no lake during their life cycle, of Arctic grayling. If you're not familiar with the Arctic grayling, I see many nods. You know, this is sort of a Dr. Seuss-like fish. When you put it back in the water, it's just beautifully iridescent with purples and blues and greens and pinks on its scales, and that great fan-like dorsal fin. A super distinct fish, and this is one of 2 places, both of which are in Montana in the lower 48 states, where you can still catch them native.
They smell really good too. They smell like thyme.
Wow, I have never heard that.
Their Latin name is Thymus.
It is Thymus, yeah.
That's why.
Yeah, huh, all right, well I'm gonna have to smell a grayling next time I catch it.
Sounds fishy to me.
That is great, I love that. Where was I? In the Grand Slam.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah, so there are brook trout in this system. Obviously they're not native to Montana or the Big Hole, and they, in most days, are the hardest of the 5 trout fish in the trout family to catch in the main stem Big Hole. There are some tributaries that have robust populations of brook trout. It's easier, but main stem river, this is probably the one where people most often leave and have only caught 4 of the 5 because they haven't caught a brook trout, surprisingly enough. Rainbow trout are prevalent in the Big Hole, and just like the brown trout, targeted species, big, robust, deep-bodied rainbows. And then our native West Slope cutthroat. I love this picture. This is just a hog of a cutthroat that came out of the Big Hole. I'm pretty sure that photo and this one are both our coworker Chris, who is the project manager down there, so spends a lot of time on these rivers. He knows where they live. You know, if you hadn't heard of the Big Hole before and you've been paying attention to news of trout and rivers in Montana this year, in all likelihood, what you've heard about are these doomsday stories of the Big Hole. You know, the Big Hole River dying, trout populations plummeting, Big Hole in peril, trout numbers at historic lows, and the New York Times with the zombie trout of the Big Hole. I mean, the numbers don't lie. Like, we are at absolute historic lows of rainbow and brown trout numbers in the Big Hole this year, and the surveys have been going on there for a good long time, and we're at the lowest they've ever been. No denying that. I want to provide a little bit of sort of big picture perspective on that, and what I think is going on, and the future of the Big Hole, which I don't think is in fact necessarily all doom and gloom. The Big Hole is a place that has always had incredibly robust advocates for it. Back in the 1960s, there was a plan by the Bureau of Reclamation when the Bureau was still building large dams around the West wherever they pretty much wanted to build what was called the Rakeley Dam in that canyony stretch of the Big Hole. I showed the one photo. It would have backed up the Big Hole for 18 miles in a real sinuous reservoir. It would have wiped out the native fishery for sure. West Slope cutthroats would have wiped out the grayling. And it was local ranchers and landowners, you know, sitting down with anglers at the time to fight this dam and stopped it. They stopped the Bureau in one of their major dam building projects. And it was one of the first of the dams that, that killed the big dam building era in America, and made the agencies think about the value of these resources beyond just hydropower. And those same coalition of ranchers and anglers got together in the 80s, and they were really the center of the advocacy around Montana's stream access law. Even though most of the land along the Big Hole is private, it was those private landowners who thought, no, we advocate for this public access in Montana along with anglers. And then in 1988, we had a really bad winter and then a dry summer, and the Big Hole went dry up at Wisdom in the upper Big Hole. And anglers, trout aficionados thought, you know, this is the apocalypse, kind of like we're seeing today, that this is the end of the Big Hole fishery. And again, ranchers and anglers got together, and basically in a handshake agreement, they came up with a drought management plan, one of the first of its kind in Montana, where they agreed that as the river starts hitting low base flows in the summer, they would have, you know, flow triggers and temperature triggers, and they just have a phone tree, and these landowners, ranchers, farmers would start calling each other and shutting off their water use to keep the river wet and cold. And anglers would pitch in by reducing their fishing. Stop fishing at 2 o'clock. It's how we wound up getting hoot owl in Montana. You know, when the water is getting warm or low, the state agency now will regulate fishing by saying you have to reel it in and be done by 2 p.m. Or if lower triggers are hit, angling just stops on the Big Hole. And that's all this voluntary drought management plan. The motto has been shared sacrifice, shared success. And it has been a success in the Big Hole. An offshoot of that has been that when the grayling numbers plummeted after this drying up of the upper river, they went from like grayling numbers of 110, 120 per mile to about 20 grayling per mile over the course of a year. Again, those same landowners voluntarily signed on to a U.S. Fish Wildlife Service agreement called a CCAA for the grayling, where if these ranchers developed a restoration plan for their own land to keep fish out of ditches, to rebuild habitat, to keep cows from grazing the streams, if the grayling ever get listed on the endangered species list, then those ranchers will not be liable for additional requirements because they've already done what they said they were going to be doing in their restoration plans. And it's worked. It's brought the grayling back there. The grayling, you know, they're not back to historic highs, but they're certainly stable, good genetic diversity. They're doing fairly well in the upper Big Hole. Which doesn't mean that the news from this year and the trout population numbers aren't a problem and of concern. And so this has combined brown and rainbow trout from not every year, but going back to the late 60s up to this year. And this is comes from our Fish Wildlife Parks biologists developed this system of trying to keep the big hole at ideal fish numbers. And so ideal fish numbers are in the green. And for both the sort of upper to middle and middle to lower stretches, that's about 1,200 to 1,500 fish per mile combined rainbow and brown trout, which again are fantastic fish numbers in a freestone, not a tailwater fishery. Also, they found through long survey that in the green, when you have those fish numbers, you have great diversity of age class and you actually get big trophy fish. As you get above that, you may have more fish, but they're all smaller. To where when you're up in the red, it's a lot of fish. You could have 2,000 to 3,000 fish per mile, but you're not going to get brown trout over 12 or 15 inches. You're not going to have the true 2-footers of the big hole. And so they've managed for that level. Well, you can see in the last couple of years, there's been a steady decline to where in the last 2 years, we're at historic lows and in the red, which has meant a couple things. It's meant that they're catch and release only regulations. There are spawning closures now from October 1 to either 3rd Saturday in May on the upper river or to April 1 on the lower river. The other thing that has happened is that in the last legislature, seeing this coming, our organization got the legislature to appropriate $2.5 million for just Southwest Montana, particularly for the big hole. And when this last year of fish numbers and diseased fish that the agency was seeing and anglers were reporting came out, they're going to dedicate this money to some PhD student study, teaming up with Montana State University to study spawning and rearing in tributaries. I was amazed to learn that we really don't know where the fish in the big hole spawn in the tributaries. And the idea is if we can learn that, if we can learn where their nurseries are, we can better direct efforts for where water needs to be, where conservation needs to be. They're also going to study angler mortality. We have taken it for granted for a long, long time that if you practice catch and release, it's no harm to the fishery. And probably in most cases that's true. But when you have a fishery that's already on its heels, and when you have increasing angler numbers in the big hole, like many other rivers in Montana, the use on our rivers during COVID were like this, right? And it's the same use I suspect you all have seen on rivers you fish, places you recreate, right? People during COVID got kicked out of their gyms or their fitness clubs and suddenly went outside. And it was a huge boom, particularly in angling. Sort of as an aside, I was talking to folks from Orvis a couple years ago and asked them about that, and they said, we have our biggest boom in sales, and people take on fly fishing when there are tough moments in the economy and in our historic arc. Like wars, the Iraq War, huge sales in Orvis. The exception to that, the one time they had huge sales that wasn't linked to that was, of course, when A River Runs Through It came out as a movie. But otherwise, they said COVID boomed their sales more than any other sort of economic slump or other thing going on. So, we're interested in studying what is the impact of increased angling pressure. It can't possibly be that you can just have more and more and infinite pressure and it not have an effect on fish. So we're hoping to learn that, and then it will be something we think about for other rivers in the West. And then the third study is disease. We have seen photos of dead fish, this brown trout with all kinds of fungus around it. The state agency has gathered the best minds in the country in fish pathology, and they've tested over 300 diseased fish that they got out of the river in labs, and so far they have not found any new disease. There's not some mysterious disease. These fish have the fungus and the pathogens that are native to the river and widespread across the West. It's just that the fish are particularly stressed from years of low warm water, and that warm water extending longer into the fall. And so at least that's the working hypothesis. And they're going to continue to study fish, continue to gather diseased fish. But so far, no new disease causing zombie trout. It's just simply tough conditions in the Big Hole, which is why we as an organization a few years ago invested in my now coworker Chris. We created a new position in Southwest Montana to work on stream flow and habitat in places like the Big Hole. Other organizations are putting resources into it as well, and that's really the way out of this. And it's a good reminder to me that I always want to pass on to others, is that when you look at the historic fish data on the Big Hole, it's a river that's been very resilient for a long time. Whirling disease hit the Big Hole and people thought it was the end of the world, and that fishery bounced back. There have been other periods of drought where the fishery's gotten pretty bad and it has bounced back. And one of the reasons why is because for a freestone river, even though we're at historic lows, we're almost at 1,000 fish or more than 1,000 fish per mile. I mean, I don't know this. Anybody know like how many eggs a single brown trout lays in a spawning season? And it's like in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands. And so there are plenty of fish in this system to reboot this population if the conditions are good during spawning season and through the winter for eggs to hatch. And in fact, 2023 was a really good water year in Montana. The skiing was great, everybody was happy, we saw lots of water coming into the summer of 2023. The brown trout red counts in this middle Melrose section were 3 times higher than they've been for the last bunch of years in 2023 and this fall. So I think there is hope here ahead, and part of that is because, you know, a single good water year, we need more of those. One thing the Big Hole does not lack are advocates who are passionate about it and have saved this river from many other things. So I'm not to the point of being too doomsday about the Big Hole. The other thing is last year, at the same time these articles were coming out, we were seeing some of the most gorgeous big brown trout photos I've ever seen out of the Big Hole from both the public and from guide and outfitter friends of ours. And so don't cancel your trip to the Big Hole. Go and enjoy it and treat the fish gently. I want to end up with a river that is particularly special to me because it in many ways changed my life, and that's the Smith River. Anybody been on the Smith in Montana? Heard of the Smith? Yeah. Put it on your bucket list if you can afford the time to do it. It's a unique river compared to these other two in that it's been a very steadily healthy wild trout river. It has not felt the same effects that that put the black hole in the black foot in the toilet that are affecting the Big Hole right now. It's just been a really steadily good trout fishery, and one big reason why is because it's been protected. And it's been protected by a permit system. When use of this river started getting higher in the 80s, the state and the U.S. Forest Service had the foresight, well, they were pushed by anglers to do this, but to put a permit system on it. So you have to apply to get on the Smith. And if you are successful, what you've gotten yourself into is a 59-mile float with no other public access the whole way. And so here's the Smith here. It flows north into the Missouri between Helena and Great Falls. It starts between the Big Belts and the Little Belt Mountains. Again, spring-fed, snowmelt-fed, agriculture in the upper stretch. But this 59-mile stretch that is the permitted stretch, you put in at a place called Camp Baker, right here, and from there 59 miles of a very windy, beautiful river. You come out at the Eden Bridge, and there's no other way to get out unless you get on somebody's private land and get your way out or get helicoptered out. So you're in for the full ride. Most people take 4, or if they're wise, 5 days to do the trip. All the markers on here are the designated campsites. You're not fighting people for campsites. It's some of the most beautiful camping in the state of Montana. Until this year, there used to be pit toilets on all of these, and I would say that some of the most beautiful places you will ever go to use the bathroom in your life on this river. And starting this year, you're going to have to bring your own toilet system on the river, and our hope and our advocacy with the agency is put designated places for people to put those where the old pit toilets were, and I think that will be heated. There's going to be a groover cleaning station at the end of it. So it's still going to be very floater friendly. It's a wild trout fishery, mostly rainbows and browns. It's known as just a trip of a lifetime by most floaters because of the great canyon scenery. Through a lot of it, you're going through these, few 100-foot limestone canyons. There are caves throughout. That's a photo from one of the famous caves people go up into. It's one of the most rich places in Montana for Native American artwork. Yeah.
Rapids?
Rapids? There is one rapid, it's called Rattlesnake Rapid, is that right? Near the lower end, and most of the time it's sort of a rock garden with a right-hand bend at the end. People canoe it in standard canoes. I mean, I don't know if I would do that. I've done it in an inflatable canoe and a tandem ducky. Rafts, people take drift boats down it. Yeah, it's not full of rapids. It's mostly a really meandering river with great undercut banks. The float season is from April to 4th of July or a little later than that. Kelly's nodding back here, and I'm looking for her on the specifics because she actually learned to fish on the Smith. She has some historic family property there and grew up, and I'm super jealous of, her family history and time on the Smith. She knows it very well. The April into early May trips before runoff, I've never done one in April, but people apply for those are hardy souls who really want to get out there and be the first ones to put flies in front of these fish. And I've heard about 100 fish days in April. I've also heard the story of ice jams trapping people in a camp for days, and they're having to get helicopter drops of food in. So there's that. I have been on a May trip where a few tents collapsed in the middle of the night from 6 or 8 inches of wet, heavy snow. So most of us apply post-runoff later in May into June when the fishing has moved from streamer fishing in the early season and San Juan worms and girdle bugs and droppers and fishing under an indicator to dry fly fishing. And there's great hatches on here: salmon fly hatch, golden stone hatch. There's a pretty renowned and elusive cicada hatch that I think Kelly has caught before. I've heard of night fishing with mice on this river can happen. And what happens with the fishery is pre-runoff and then certainly during runoff when it's high and brown, you can still catch fish, but mostly you're casting up into the grass. The water is up into the grass and the willows, and you're fishing inside banks and that softer water. And then as runoff subsides, fish move out into the deeper water, and certainly as it gets hot during the summer, they move up against these canyon walls, and you're fishing up against these gorgeous canyon walls. When you have these strikes, you can hear your hoot and holler and just echo down the canyon. And that can be really great fun dry fly fishing throughout the rest of the season there. Again, the fishery is really known for its brown trout and rainbow trout as well. One thing I would say about this fishery that is most fun for me, and I think two things are unique about it. One is that these fish, like I said, just don't see a lot of pressure. They don't see a lot of pressure because the fishing doesn't start until April, and it's done by midsummer at the latest. They also don't see pressure because of the 1,000+ permits that get issued every year, and each permit holder gets to invite up to 20 people, I think, is the cap. Maybe it's 24. Most party sizes are 8 or 12. Every year in, year out, 70 to 75% of people who float this river don't bring a rod, don't have a fishing license. And so it's really a minority of people floating it who are fishing. It is not uncommon to be on this river and see a whole float party go with all kinds of kayaks and stand-up paddle boards and people just basking in the sun and drinking beer and watching the scenery, and even trips where you see a fly rod in the boat. Half those times the fly rod just in the back of the boat, people aren't fishing. So if you go to fish, you're going to have good opportunity fishing to fish that have not seen a lot of bugs. I don't know that I've ever caught a fish on the Smith where I've seen hooking scars, and I would say that almost to the fish, the brown trout are the most acrobatic brown trout I've ever caught. I mean, they jump and squirm and fight hard more than brown trout that I've caught anywhere else, and it can be a lot of fun. They strike hard. It can be a wonderful fishery. The other thing that's super unique about it, now, you know, most trout streams depend on their tributaries, right? It's where there's good gravel size. It's where the fish go to spawn. It's where the young are safe and can rear there. The Smith is particularly dependent on its tributaries for spawning, but also for the health of the adult fish, because the main river gets so low and warm after the float season. That's why the float season ends, is you can't get a boat down it. I mean, it's just on the stones, literally. And it's the few tributaries that all these fish pile into. I'm going to show this just couple second video here shot by a graduate student that we helped fund to research trout movement in the Smith a few years ago, and so he was tagging trout and then seeing where they moved and tracking their movement all the way out to the Missouri River and into other trout streams and back, coming back to their natal tributaries. But during the summer, he snorkeled up Sheep Creek tributary, which is coming into the main Smith right here. This is where you launch your boat. Right across the river, you see Sheep Creek coming in. During high flows, it provides about half the water to the Smith. And as you can see, the main Smith is brown with silt, and the Sheep Creek, even during runoff, is crystal clear. Also at low flows, it's providing about half the water of the Smith, and it's good and cold. And so this is a shot during late summer when the river is warm and what happens in these tributaries. And this is a tributary that at that time you could walk across with 2 or 3 steps, and it's just packed full of fish in every little pocket. And these are native mountain whitefish. I think we're going to get some shots of rainbows in here, but they just absolutely pack in there in ways that you don't see on bigger, colder main stem rivers. So the tributaries can be great fun as the season progresses to wade fish. You know, you get out of your boat, you can legally walk up these tributaries, and you can practice casting with, you know, something like a Winston 8-foot 4-weight would be perfect, I would say.
Great idea.
Yeah, you catch a little shade in the Ponderosa groves, and it's pretty much a dry fly game. And so these tributaries, particularly Sheep Creek, are the lifeblood of the Smith River. This is the Smith right here, and as you can see, I've highlighted that they're really, part of the reason the tributaries are also so important is there just aren't many of them. There's Sheep Creek, right where you put in, and then downriver away is Tenderfoot Creek. There's one called Rock Creek in here, and then there's an Eagle Creek, and that's kind of it for the cold water tributaries in this whole 59-mile stretch. And so they're, again, the lifeblood of the Smith. And the other reason I'm bringing them up is that, you know, this is a fishery that has been sustained for many years because of the protections of the permit system, but it's now facing a new threat for the Smith. It's an old threat in Montana that the permit system isn't going to help, and that is that about 10 years ago, an Australian-owned mining company started applying for permits to build a large industrial-scale copper mine right up next to Sheep Creek. All the green is public land, U.S. Forest Service land, both the light and the darker shaded green. The white is all private land, and the purple is the private land where this mining company has leased mineral rights from the private property owners. The yellow is where they're planning this mine, right up against the banks of Sheep Creek. If you zoom into their mine plan, to give you some perspective, that's Sheep Creek. They're going to be right on the edge of that. There are some tributaries to Sheep Creek that go right through the mine workings, including this big gray blob that is sited. This is where they're going to put all their tailings, which are highly acidic, high risk of causing that orange water, acid mine drainage. Give you perspective, this is 5 football fields across, 7 football fields top to bottom. They're going to be putting 7 or 8 million cubic tons of mine waste there through the life of the mine, which is only 10 or 12 years, and has this huge risk to the Smith in both water quantity and quality. When they started applying for this, Montana Trout Unlimited got involved, and we have been bird dogging the process all along. If this were baseball, they would be out. We sort of offered comments on 3 of their applications that all got kicked back because they were deficient and no good, but 3 strikes was not enough. And in 2020, the state of Montana, our Department of Environmental Quality, granted them a permit for this mine. We litigated on two different cases, one challenging the permit, saying that the company and the state did not properly analyze the risk to water quality and quantity. And then we also have challenged their water rights. They have to have water rights to pump the water out of the mines, to mill, to pump tailings into here, and they have only got water rights for about half the amount of water they're going to use, which is a massive amount of water. So we have 2 sets of litigation. 2022, we won the permit challenge on every count in district court, and their permit was revoked. And it was, it was a cork popping day in the office, as I remember. Unfortunately, a month ago, the company and the state appealed this decision to the Montana Supreme Court, and the Montana Supreme Court overturned the lower court and reinstated their permit. Our water rights case will be heard in front of the Montana Supreme Court tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. It's going to be, I think they're going to have a live stream of it at 9 o'clock here, and I'll be happy to provide anybody with the live stream link if you're interested and really want to geek out on this water right case. We won't have, these kind of cases, nobody walks out in handcuffs. There's no decision right there, unfortunately. It'll be 4 or 6 months before we have a decision. But we are hopeful about our water rights case. It's a tough case to make, but the Supreme Court in Montana right now has indicated through other cases that they are more protective of water rights than they have been of the permitting system. And so it gives us some hope that will be the decision here. If we won that case, it would be very hard for this company to come up with sufficient water rights that they could operate. There just isn't that much water in this area for them to get through, buying farmers or ranchers' water rights. The third thing we're doing is back to this map. I said all the green is public lands. The dark green, this company has applied for about 700 mining claims on public land, on U.S. Forest Service land. They tell their investors overseas that they're going to move on to public land, which is free in the United States. They pay no royalties on minerals, even if you're a foreign country or company. And so we are asking the Forest Service, petitioning the Forest Service right now to withdraw all mining claims on public lands within that red border to protect both Sheep Creek and Tenderfoot Creek. And so, we're running a petition trying to get support from the Forest Service to withdraw these. So if they ever develop a mine on the private land, they'd never be able to move on to public land and would dampen their investment and certainly keep their footprint smaller. How...
What company is this?
So the parent company is Sandfire Resources out of Australia. The local company, they set up a small local subsidiary called Tintina. Tintina's never mined for anything in the United States or elsewhere. They're a brand new subsidiary, completely funded by the parent company. The parent company, Sandfire, is a large copper mining company. They have a huge copper mine in Botswana they bought a year ago, as well as one in Australia. They're being sued by Aboriginal tribes in Australia for completely desecrating a bunch of native land there. So that's kind of their track record in terms of the local community.
Why did they buy the property on the river there? It looks like the purple on the...
This purple?
Is that them too?
Yeah, no. These are standard colors for... This is... So green is U.S. Forest Service, blue is state land, white is private, and purple is, yellow's BLM, purple is, what would be the other federal purple land up there? I'm completely blanking on that, but it's not private. No, and so they haven't bought the land. What they've done is they've leased the mineral rights on private land, and so that's happened here and this chunk over here. Yeah, if you know anybody who wants a ranch in Montana, the way to really stop this mine for good would be if we stop them through litigation, to have somebody go in and just buy a chunk of this in here, right in the heart of where they're going to mine, and retire the minerals into a conservation easement. And it'd be right in the heart of where this copper vein is, and that would make it really hard to mine in there. So, you know, if you know somebody looking for a ranch in Montana, right near a great trout stream.
What about Western Rivers Conservancy? Are they floating the idea?
You know, we were talking about Western Rivers Conservancy over our foreshortened dinner, and it's a great idea, actually.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know those folks well, although we were talking about them because they just bought a ranch in the Big Hole that we are working with them to transfer water rights to in-stream flows there. That's going to be a significant increase in water. So it's a great idea. Yeah.
What they need is a takeout. They buy land, but they usually use other people's money. The money that they raise, to do the due diligence and all of that, but they don't end up holding land. So they usually need some agency or some entity to take them out.
Right. They know that down the line. So it's, yeah. Right. I mean, that's like some land trust, right? They will buy it in the short term till they get a long-term buyer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or turn it over to BLM.
Right.
Well, but BLM doesn't always, a lot of the federal agencies don't take restrictions in your deeds nowadays. They used to, but they don't.
Right.
You're never sure what BLM may flip on you under a different administration.
I mean, it'd be a beautiful private ranch, you know.
Why isn't the mine bought it?
Because they're just there for the minerals. They will walk away as soon as the ore is gone.
Well, then they'll leave the mess for the landowner.
And
No, I
they'll,
just meant to prevent something, like, it seems like they would do that just to prevent that from happening.
yeah.
I'm not on that.
It's just, yeah, no, I mean, right. Yeah, it's a good question. Why? And maybe it's because the landowners are active ranchers. They don't want to sell, right? It's a family ranch. You know, one difficulty for this is certainly going to be there's a lease contract between the company and the landowners. And so you'd get into contract law, and they would break a contract, and there would be litigation. That's why I said, you know, the prime time to do this would be as if we win on this water rights suit and this company walks away from it because obtaining the water rights are too tough, you know. They may walk away, but some other mining company is going to come in here. It is a rich copper vein. It's small and contained, but it would be 10 or 12 years of profit for shareholders, assuming copper prices are where they need to be.
The EPA up in the Pebble mine, up in Alaska, you know, they've gone, different administrations have ruled differently, but there's a federal nail in the coffin right now.
Right.
Has there been any, does the federal have any jurisdiction on this?
There is no federal nexus. No, because it's all on private land. As soon as they tried to move onto public land, if we don't get a mineral withdrawal, then there would be a federal nexus. And
Water quality issue downstream?
so the EPA, so the state law is called MEPA, the Montana Environmental Protection Act. If they moved onto federal land, the permit would be under NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, which is stronger than the Montana law. I mean, our mining laws are just weak. I get pissed at the state of Montana and DEQ for issuing them this permit, but the state has very little ability to say no. Our mining laws are skewed towards development when it comes to mining.
Another end of the conservation fund does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, you know, it's not as simple as just going in and buying a ranch, but it would be the nail in the coffin for the foreseeable future of a possible mine on the Smith to acquire some of that private property in there. I also think it would be, I believe in this mineral withdrawal. I believe if we got the mineral withdrawal, it would really dissuade investment, and they might think twice about all they're going to have to pour into it for only 10 years of mining on private land. They might not even make up their investment in 10 years, and so they could walk away from it. We seem to have naturally moved into the Q&A, which is great, because I was going to say the only other hopeful message I have on the Smith is that I got invited to float on it in May, so that's great. Yeah.
How does a person get permission to float?
Yeah, so you just apply to the state of Montana through Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. The application period is usually January 1st through the end of the middle of February. Costs you $5 to apply. It's a lottery. It's a lottery.
With the guy out there that have a certain set of permits over the course of the year, and we have some of those guys out there are really good to us as a conservation organization, so if you're gonna do it, reach out to us. I mean, we've gone down with donors, we can tell you which ones have the best food and.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was curious, back to the Blackfoot, you were showing those graphs, and you were seeing the native fish in the early 80s were decimated, but it didn't look like that was the case for the brown and rainbow trout at that same, their line was way up here. Is there a reason or a cause for that?
You know, they're just hardier in tough conditions than the native trout. And those data were from 1988. Certainly, if they had been collecting data mid-century or back, I think the brown trout and rainbow trout numbers would have been down near zero too. I mean, they had actually come back some because by that time, like the clear-cut logging had been done. Those kind of photos that I showed of logs in the Blackfoot, that was done, you know, that was kind of done by probably 1940s, certainly by the end of World War II. So they had come back simply because brown trout and rainbows are a little hardier under those tough conditions.
So to follow up on that, for the big hole, that was the emphasis on the brown trout and rainbow trout. I would assume it's worse for the other native species there than those even, or?
Yeah, I mean the numbers of West Slope cutthroat trout in the big hole are particularly low, and it's one reason again we hired this project manager for Southwest Montana is the state, and we have joined the state in this goal of the upper Missouri, so the tributaries to the Missouri, the Jefferson, Gallatin, Madison, Jefferson, Madison, Gallatin. The goal is to restore West Slope cutthroat trout to 20% of their historic range in all of those watersheds. Right now they're at like 4% of their historic range, so it seems like a lofty goal, but in the last year meeting with the state, I think we're going to be there in 10 years through the restoration work we're doing, through removing small dams, creating barriers in other places to get rid of brook trout and give the West Slopes a good chance, and then just more water in places. And I mean, yes, we put a lot of effort into native trout and West Slopes in this case, but the philosophy is that if it's good for the West Slopes, it's good for all trout. Yeah.
Do you have any data, either fish counts or catch rates per angler hour on the Madison?
The Madison has the oldest data set in the state of Montana, and I don't have that with me right now, but it's out there, and I could certainly provide you with it. I know that Jim knows it well, and you know he should probably actually answer that question. He's our resident expert on the Madison. The Madison numbers are down and near historic lows in stretches. Not the whole river, and because it's a tailwater river, you know, it has some resiliency because of the tailwater, but no, it's of concern right now for sure. But one of the best things, should I even say this? I mean, one of the best things we could do for the Madison, and I'd love to hear if we could get rid of Ennis Lake. I mean, it's just a big, you know, solar grabber for the river. It just warms water up right there. I don't know if you've ever floated through Bear Trap Canyon below it. It is the most fishy brown trout water. I mean, it's also, it's the biggest whitewater in Montana, I think, for that amount of stretch. It's, you know, you need to know what you're doing on the oars to get down there, but it looks like super fun brown trout water.
It's the only type 1 whitewater blue ribbon trout fishing stream in the country.
Yeah.
But I would say, as it relates to Ennis Lake, that it still has a population of grayling. Most people don't know about.
It does.
And for a number of months in the early season, it's some of the most fabulous dry fly fishing that you can have on a still water in the state. But it is a huge heat sink.
Yeah.
And it does no favors to the lower river.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So is Ennis Lake man-made or is it natural?
No, there's a dam right at the top of Bear Trap Canyon, so it's very much a man-made.
Is this downstream from Ennis?
It is
Yes.
just downstream, and it's a hydropower dam. Northwest Energy produces hydropower, not in the dam. It's a real weird system where it goes down through a pipe, and there's a generating station a mile or so below it. Yeah, yeah. And thanks for moving. I mean, we don't have to just talk about the Blackfoot Big Hole and and the Smith. I try to fish new water every year. I'm a long way from having fished all the water in Montana, but I'll do my best to talk about anywhere you want to talk about in Montana. Yeah.
On the Bitterroot, several years ago when I was fishing it, squawfish were starting to appear. And they were invasive and they didn't like them. Is that a growing issue, and does it exist in any other rivers?
So I think what you're talking about, that's sort of a nickname for the fish, which I think you're talking about the northern pike minnow.
Might have been.
Yeah, and it is native to a lot of the rivers in western Montana. Perhaps not the Bitterroot. I'm not totally sure about that. But as we're seeing climate change, both timing of flows and temperatures on water, we're certainly seeing shifts in populations. The bigger concern on the Bitterroot and the rivers, those sort of bigger, slower trout rivers of western Montana, like the Bitterroot and the Clark Fork, particularly where we live, Missoula on downstream, are pike, just northern pike. In the sloughs, they eat a lot of trout. We're kind of been starting to think about advocating for a mandatory catch and kill on pike, and smallmouth bass moving up from the lower Clark Fork and the Flathead system. Those are the ones I hear about as non-natives that are going to compete for trout habitat.
Do they get big? Those pike?
Oh yeah, 3-4 feet. Yeah, people are pulling over their guide boats and having clients angle for them on streamers in these side channels just because, it's fun to catch a 4-foot fish on a fly ride, right? Why wouldn't you?
Winston Four-Way. That's a
Yeah, you better bring a bigger gun if you're going to fish for those pike.
Is that a saying the water's warming up when the pike and the smallmouth's moving in?
Sorry, one more time.
Is that a sign of the water warming up when the pike is moving in?
It is. Yeah, it is. And it's also just, particularly in those sloughs, smallmouth can do all right in colder water. I'm actually amazed that we don't have more smallmouth right up into Missoula and in the lower Bitterroot. There's nothing stopping them from the Flathead, where there's a good population of them, from coming up there. And I've asked our fisheries biologists, and they're like, "Oh yeah, they're smallmouth here and there, but they don't really seem to have taken off like you would think." But the pike numbers are definitely going up, and I think it's water temperature. Some of it is also that the sloughs are becoming more permanent because we're not getting as regular of big spring runoffs, changing the character of the river and washing some slough out, evulsing somewhere else, and creating new habitats. You're getting these permanent, slow, warm sloughs where they can overwinter. It'd be great to have a huge winter of big flows in the spring and ice scour and drive those things out of there. Yeah.
Back to the Smith, from Sheep Creek to the confluence with the Missouri, what's that distance?
So Sheep Creek to the takeout at Eden Bridge is the 59 miles. I've never floated below that. I've hunted birds in there. I'm going to go with it's about another 30 to 40 miles of river.
Okay.
Yeah, and it gets pretty, it's a lot of ag land in there. You could float it. It certainly gets warm later in the season.
I'm going back to the contaminating by mine tailings issue.
Yes.
So if you've got ag dependency for ag water and domestic water, Great Falls is probably pulling its domestic from the Missouri.
Yep.
So conceivably, all of that pollution could end up in the boat.
The mayor of Great Falls has written a resolution. It's supported by the city council in Great Falls with concerns about this mine. They've signed, letters that we've asked municipalities to sign because they're the downstream municipality to be worried about it.
Right.
Others, Helena, Missoula, Bozeman, they've even signed on to letters and protests on this mine because of just the outdoor recreation industry in Montana is now bigger than ag.
So you get your Aaron Brockovich is involved, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, we did.
Yeah.
We turned out more than 10,000 comments opposing this mine permit during the public comment period, which is more than the DEQ had ever gotten on a permit before, and they still issued the permit. Yeah, the public opinion doesn't sway their decision.
Do you think if the Smith didn't have that permitting system to get onto it, and it was a bigger fishery, even though it'd be bad in the long run, probably, that maybe it would have not, it would have hurt them because how much money came into that area?
Yeah. My feeling is that even though the permit system limits the number of people that can go any given year, and yeah, I've been applying to go on that river for 20 years since the first time I went on it on a friend's permit. I've never gotten the permit, not once. Never been a permit holder. I think that people still, as many people still care about it, even though they don't get to go on it every year. And I do think that the flip side of that, which you recognize, is if there weren't a permit system, that fishery would not be what it is. It would be, and the other thing about the fishery, it wouldn't be just because people are fishing it, is because before the permit system, it was dispersed camping, camp wherever you want, under the high water mark, and it would trash a lot of the habitat. I mean, you know, these permanent campsites, they're great because you know where you're going, they're assigned, you're not fighting people for campsites, but in terms of habitat, they're kind of sacrifice zones along the river, right? They get pretty well trampled. And so I think the blow to the Smith would have been big had we not had this permit system.
Are there commercial guides that do trips down there? And
Yes.
Are they subject to the same lottery thing, or do they have a separate?
No, there are a limited number. The permits are capped for guides, and you know, the people who own them, and they can sell them when they get out of the business. But yeah, there are only 5 outfitters who are permitted to guide on the Smith and have all the permits. They limit it to, is it 1 commercial trip per day launches or 2? Two per day. They have caps on the number of people they can bring. Plus, they also don't like to bring big parties. It's usually eight anglers, 4 guides, and maybe 1 gear boat.
But if you want to pay, you could do it. Instead
Absolutely.
Of waiting, holding your breath for 20 years.
Yep. If you want to find a guide, ask us. We can recommend, like Kelly said, the people who have the best dinners and give you a cocktail as soon as you get out of the boat. And
Well, David.
Yes.
So I've heard rumors of a $100 million amount of money that the state has geared toward the fisheries, the troubled fisheries now. Have you heard anything like that? By the way, this came from within FWP.
Yeah. I mean, FWP has a lot of money right now because our state budget has been good the last 2 legislative cycles. I don't think money is an issue when it comes to their efforts in Southwest Montana right now. I haven't heard the $100 million figure. We have the person on our staff, Clayton, who's our policy guy, who works year-round on policy, moves to Helena during the legislature. He could get me the exact number. And to the degree that they have a bunch of money, it's because we go and sit on the appropriations committee and we get our state agencies money. They are well-resourced right now. Like, resources should not be the problem. It's not a money problem. Yeah.
I know, I fished the Lamar Fork of the Yellowstone, and I know you have to kill rainbow trout and non-native species. Is there interest in like expanding that to other rivers in Montana?
Yes, I mean, in super case-by-case basis. That is because Yellowstone National Park has put a ton of effort into getting rid of non-native fish. In the Lamar, the big non-native fish that's hybridizing with Yellowstone cutthroat is rainbow trout. So it's mandatory catch and kill. And even just outside of the park, the main tributary to the Lamar that is the biggest source of rainbows right now is called Buffalo Creek. And the U.S. Forest, it's not in the park. It's mostly Forest Service land. So the Forest Service and the state Fish Wildlife agencies have a plan to go in there and get rid of all the rainbows for like 70 miles of tributary up into wilderness area and restore Yellowstone cutthroat.
Was it Rotenall?
Rotenone. Yep. Yeah, rotenone is the piscicide that kills anything with gills, and then they neutralize it right at the bottom of the treatment zone, and then put the new fish in there. And that project has been delayed because of a lawsuit by a wilderness group that just doesn't want any action being done in the wilderness. And I think they're going to get over the hump of that, and that project could happen late summer 2024, certainly 2025. Yeah, I mean, it is hard to turn around a fishery that has invasive fish in it through angler effort. Especially if it's a main stem river, you know, it's just really hard. Yeah. The way to do it effectively is you have to find a tributary where you can build a fish barrier so that those non-natives can't get back up it, right? And then treat it and put the natives back in there.
Did I mishear you when you were talking about the Blackfoot, that you said it's undammed now, but that might change? Maybe I misheard.
Yeah, and maybe I misspoke. It's undammed now, but there were dams on it. And so there were essentially 3 dams that impacted the Blackfoot. There was that tailings dam at the top that blew out and contaminated the river. There was the dam that stopped all the logs at Milltown. And then there was the dam at the confluence of the Clark Fork and the Milltown Dam. And that was a 30-year Superfund saga where Milltown got designated as one of the first Superfund sites in the country. It was the bottom of the largest Superfund site in the country, the entire Clark Fork from Butte all the way down there. And it became the first dam removal in the country under Superfund. And so they took out that Milltown Dam and the smaller dam up the Blackfoot in between 2008 and 2012. And one of the real crux moments in taking those out was a young fisheries biologist started wondering, are these dams still even blocking migrating fish who are trying to get back upriver? Like, the dam's been there 100 years. Certainly these fish have forgotten that they want to go back up the Blackfoot. So he goes down to the bottom of the Milltown Dam during spring and fall and just finds not thousands or tens of thousands, but over 100,000 fish literally banging their head on that dam, like head scars from trying to get up it. Scoops fish of all different species up into coolers, puts radio tags on them, trucks them around the dam and throws them in the reservoir to watch to see where they go. And most of them went up the Blackfoot. And that was like this moment where anglers and the public were like, what? This dam is stopping hundreds of thousands of fish from getting up there? And it became one of the nails in the coffin of that dam and getting it taken down.
So Dave, you know an awful lot about that part of Montana history. You should write a book.
I did write the book on that dam removal and the history of Superfund. So yeah, cut me off because I could keep us here all night on that subject. I mean, and it's, you know, I think we need success stories in the world of conservation and the environment. It's part of the reason I took on that story and wrote about it. Probably some of the same motivation you writing a book about this place. It's, you know, we need stories of things that have succeeded. They're motivators. They provide us with a way forward when we face challenges, right?
By the way, David is a very humble guy. If you're interested, I highly recommend the book. It is the first Superfund cleanup site in the country, and he's done a really wonderful job in documenting it, and it's a great read.
What's the name? What do you call that book?
Restoring the Shining Waters. That stretch of the Clark Fork in the native Salish language translated into the Shining Waters. And so yeah, that's the origin of the name of it. It's on sale in the lobby. Maybe I should have brought a box of books.
We should have done that.
I'm not very good at self-promotion in that way.
Yeah, we have some dams coming down, so you could
Yeah, no, it is cool to see. And, you know, sorry to go off on this tangent, but, you know, part of what I wrote about was that this dam going down really was part of, I think, this new era we're in of taking, you know, we stopped building dams, big dams by and large in the 60s, like that Rakeley Dam on the Big Hole, and now we're in the mode of taking them down. You know, Klamath dams, All this talk about the dams, the Snake River dams, big dams are aging out for one, right? These reservoirs are filling up with sediment. They've outlived their life. They're becoming expensive to maintain, and I think that the taking down of dams is part of a bigger picture where we've moved in conservation from protection and conservation to restoration. I mean, the flip side of that is it kind of means we've screwed enough things up. We're now having to go fix things. But that's where we are in terms of the environmental movement, is a lot of energy is being put into restoration.
Thank you.
Well,
Yeah, thank you all.
really appreciate that. That was wonderful, and really want to thank him for the Before we leave, Dave, I think you need to let the folks at Winston know that the winner was one of the most famous fly fisher photographers in the history of the business, Val Atkinson.
Wow,
So,
all right.
Well, you can tell them that's the first thing I ever won.
So, at the